I sat in the boardroom, watching the federal auditor slide a toxicology report across the table that didn't just kill the $400 million deal, it proved my son-in-law was a drug addict. My daughter screamed as the DNA test revealed the blood in the vial wasn't mine. It belonged to her husband, and it was laced with the exact same drugs they used to poison me. They thought I was a senile cancer patient they could kill for profit. They forgot I was a retired chemist, and I had turned their own blood samples into a chemical weapon. This is how I destroyed a biotech unicorn from a wheelchair. Hit subscribe. Class is in session. The air conditioning in the executive conference room of Ethelgard Biopharma was set to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the temperature of a morgue, or perhaps a clean room designed to keep bacteria from multiplying. For the men in the $3,000 suits across the table, it was crisp and professional. For an 80-year-old man strapped into a wheelchair, wearing a thin, humiliating hospital gown covered by a blazer that didn't fit, it was freezing. I didn't shiver, though. Shivering required muscle tension, and muscle tension suggested higher brain function. I needed to look like a sack of wet flour. I let my head loll to the left, my chin resting on the absorbent bib my daughter, Sarah, had tied around my neck. "Here, let me get that for you, Dad," Sarah whispered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. She pulled a tissue from her designer bag and wiped a string of saliva from my lip. She pressed hard, digging her manicured nail into my gum just enough to cause a flare of pain, but not enough to leave a mark. It was a subtle reminder: stay down, stay quiet. She turned back to the table, flashing that smile she had perfected in medical school, the one that showed 32 teeth but zero warmth. It was a shark's smile, predatory, efficient, and completely devoid of empathy. "I apologize, gentlemen," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweetness. "The excitement is a bit much for him. His cognitive decline has been rapid since the treatments ended, but as you can see, the physical recovery is nothing short of miraculous. He's cancer-free, a living testament to the Ethelgard protocol." I stared blankly at the polished mahogany table. In my peripheral vision, I could see the distorted reflection of my own face. I looked pathetic, slack-jawed, glassy-eyed, gray-skinned. A masterpiece of performance art. Inside, however, my mind was racing at the speed of a centrifuge. I was calculating variables, measuring angles, and waiting for the catalyst. Across the table sat the auditors from Meridian Global, the conglomerate preparing to buy Sarah and Mark's startup for $400 million. They were serious men. They didn't care about the sob story. They cared about the asset. And right now, I was the asset. I wasn't a father. I was patient zero, the proof of concept, the golden goose that laid the golden egg and then had the decency to get dementia so he couldn't ask for a cut of the profits. Mark, my son-in-law, sat at the head of the table. He was the CEO, ostensibly, though everyone knew Sarah held the leash. Mark looked terrible. His skin was the color of old parchment, and a sheen of sweat coated his forehead despite the frigid air. He was tapping his Mont Blanc pen against the table, a nervous staccato rhythm that echoed in the silence. Tap, tap, tap. He took a sip of water, his hand trembling slightly. I watched the vibration in the water glass, a frequency of roughly 4 hertz. Tremors, diaphoresis, confusion. The symptoms were setting in perfectly. He thought he was hungover from the expensive scotch he'd guzzled last night. He had no idea he was metabolizing a precise mixture of scopolamine and beta blockers I'd introduced to his decanter 12 hours ago.
"So," Mark said, his voice rasping. He cleared his throat violently. "The contracts. We're ready to close? The IP transfer is all there?" The lead auditor, a man named Mr. Sterling, who looked like he had been carved out of granite, didn't reach for his pen. He sat with his hands folded over a thick blue folder. The silence in the room stretched thin, like a rubber band about to snap. "The IP is in order, Mr. Reynolds. Sterling said. His voice was monotone, betraying nothing. We've reviewed the patent filings, the Phase 2 trial data, and the financial projections. On paper, Ethelgard is a unicorn, a cure for stage 4 pancreatic cancer with a 90% success rate. It's not just paper, Sarah interjected, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. She squeezed. It wasn't affectionate, it was a clamp. It's sitting right here. My father was on his deathbed 3 months ago. Now look at him. The tumor markers are non-existent. We see him, Dr. Sarah, Sterling said. He slowly opened the blue folder. And that is where we have hit a snag. The air in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Sarah's hand froze on my shoulder. Mark stopped tapping his pen. A snag? Mark asked, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a cough. What kind of snag? The independent medical exam was this morning. You drew the blood yourself. You ran it through your own labs. It's the cleanest bill of health you'll ever see. It is indeed a clean bill of health, Sterling agreed. He pulled a sheet of paper from the folder and slid it across the mahogany. It stopped perfectly in front of Mark. Too clean, in fact. The blood sample we analyzed shows zero evidence of cancer cells. It also shows zero evidence of the metabolic byproducts usually associated with the Ethelgard protocol. Sarah's grip on my shoulder tightened until I thought she might bruise the bone. That's the point, she hissed, her shark smile faltering. The drug metabolizes completely. It leaves no trace. That's why it's revolutionary. There is another issue, Sterling continued, ignoring her. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Mark. We ran a standard DNA verification on the sample, standard due diligence to ensure the sample wasn't tampered with or swapped. We compared the blood drawn from patient 0 this morning against the background check DNA on file for the patient. Mark wiped the sweat from his brow. And it's his blood. I watched you draw it. The DNA doesn't match the patient, Mr. Reynolds, Sterling said. The room went dead silent. The hum of the projector fan seemed to roar. That's ridiculous, Sarah snapped. The lab must have made a mistake. Contamination. He's sitting right here. Sterling shook his head slowly. We ran it 3 times. The DNA in the vial labeled patient 0 does not match your father, Dr. Sarah. However, because we run comprehensive background checks on all executive officers during a buyout of this magnitude, we had other profiles in our system to cross-reference. Sterling leaned forward. The predator was closing in. The blood in the vial matches you, Mr. Reynolds.
Mark blinked. Once. Twice. The information hit his drugged brain like a sledgehammer, but he couldn't process it. Me? That's impossible. I didn't give blood. You drew it from him. He pointed a shaking finger at me. We drew it from the patient's arm, Sterling said, his voice hardening. But the biological material inside the vial belongs to the CEO, which implies that at some point between the needle entering the vein and the sample reaching our cooler, a swap occurred, a clumsy one. Sarah was paralyzed. She was staring at the vial in her mind, the one she had swapped during the seizure chaos this morning. She knew she had swapped it. She had prepared the safe blood herself. She had taken it from the fridge where she kept the clean samples. How? Her mind was screaming the question. How did Mark's blood get into the safe vial? Mark stood up, swaying dangerously. The beta blockers were tanking his blood pressure. This is a setup. You're trying to tank the stock price. I demand a retest. Sterling looked at the paper again. We also found high concentrations of scopolamine and ethanol in the blood sample. Honestly, Mr. Reynolds, if this is your blood, you should be in a hospital, not a boardroom. You are chemically compromised. I'm not compromised, Mark yelled, slamming his hand on the table. He missed the table slightly, his depth perception failing. He stumbled, catching himself on the back of his chair. He's the vegetable. Look at him. He doesn't even know what year it is.
Everyone looked at me. Sarah, Mark, the auditors. I was just a prop. A senile old chemist who had outlived his usefulness. A loose end to be tied off with an insulin overdose later tonight. It was time. I took a deep breath. I filled my lungs, savoring the sterile air. I felt the muscles in my neck engage. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my head off the bib. The motion was smooth, controlled, not the jerky movements of a Parkinson's patient. I sat up straight, my spine cracking satisfyingly against the wheelchair back. I reached up and untied the bib, pulling it from my neck and dropping it onto the floor. Sarah gasped. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. She stepped back as if I were a corpse rising from a coffin. I reached into the pocket of my blazer, the pocket where they had thoughtfully left a handkerchief, and wiped the fake drool from my chin. I folded the handkerchief neatly and placed it on the table.
I turned my head to Mr. Sterling. My eyes were clear, sharp, the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years synthesizing volatile compounds in high-pressure environments. "Mr. Sterling," I said. My voice was raspy from disuse, but steady. It cut through the room like a scalpel. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her face draining of color. I ignored her. I kept my eyes on the auditor. "Dr. Sarah, we have a problem with the patient 0 blood work," Sterling repeated, though he looked stunned. "The DNA doesn't match the patient, it matches the CEO." I smiled. It wasn't a shark smile. It was the smile of a teacher correcting a student who had failed the final exam. "That's because you're not analyzing my blood," I said, pointing a steady finger at Mark, who was clutching his chest. "You're analyzing the man who tried to poison me."
3 months before the boardroom froze over, I was packing the last of my books into a cardboard box. My house was a modest craftsman bungalow in the suburbs, paid off in 1998. It smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and the lemon oil I used on the wood paneling. It was a good smell, the smell of a life lived quietly and competently. Sarah stood in the doorway, tapping her foot. She was wearing scrubs, though she hadn't worked a shift at a hospital in 2 years. Since she and Mark launched Aphelgard Biopharma, her work consisted of begging venture capitalists for money and dodging FDA compliance officers. "Dad, come on," she said, checking her watch. "The movers are expensive. We need to get you to the estate before the investors arrive for the dinner." "I don't see why I can't stay here," I grumbled, taping the box shut. "I'm 80, Sarah. I'm not an invalid. I mowed the lawn yesterday." "You mowed the flower bed, Dad," she lied. I paused. I hadn't mowed the flower bed. I knew exactly where the mower deck was set. But when a doctor, your own daughter, tells you that your mind is slipping, you hesitate, you doubt. That was the first crack in the foundation. "The scans don't lie, Arthur," Mark said, walking in from the hallway. He was holding a tablet, displaying a grayscale image of a pancreas that looked like a nebulous storm cloud. "Stage 4, Arthur. The lesions are aggressive. If we leave you here alone, you'll be in septic shock within a month." I looked at the tablet. I saw shadows and light. I was a chemical engineer for 40 years. I specialized in polymers and industrial solvents. I knew how to read a mass spectrometer readout, not an MRI. To me, it just looked like bad static. "I feel fine," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "That's the silent killer," Sarah said, stepping forward and taking my hand. Her palms were cold. "Pancreatic cancer doesn't hurt until it's too late, but we caught it. We caught it just in time for the protocol." The protocol, the holy grail, the drug that was supposed to turn Aphelgard from a penny stock into a Fortune 500 titan. "I don't want chemotherapy," I told them. I had seen what platinum-based drugs did to my wife, Martha. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution of the soul. "No chemo," Sarah promised. "That's archaic. We're using targeted gene therapy, bioengineered enzymes. It eats the cancer and leaves the healthy cells alone. But we can't do it here. We need you at the house. We have the monitoring equipment set up in the guest suite." She squeezed my hand. "Let me save you, Dad. Please." Put that way, what choice did I have? I was the father. She was the daughter. It was my job to let her win.
The guest suite at their sprawling modern estate was less a bedroom and more a containment unit. White walls, white tile floors, recessed lighting that hummed at a frequency only I seemed to hear. There was a hospital bed in the center, flanked by monitors and IV poles. For the first week, nothing happened. I sat in bed, reading spy novels, feeling perfectly healthy.
I ate steak, I drank wine, I walked around the manicured grounds. Then, the stock market opened on Monday. Mark came into the room, his eyes glued to his phone. "We're live," he muttered. "The press release just went out. Aethelgard initiates compassionate use trial on family member. The sympathy angle is tracking huge on social media." Sarah entered moments later carrying a tray. On it was a bag of clear fluid and a butterfly needle. "It's time, Dad," she said. She was smiling, but her eyes were tight. "First dose." I sat on the edge of the bed. I rolled up my sleeve. My veins were still good, thick and blue, the veins of a man who worked with his hands. "Does it hurt?" I asked. "You might feel a little chill," she said, "maybe a metallic taste in your mouth. That means it's working. It means the enzymes are binding to the tumors." She swabbed my arm. The alcohol felt cold. She was efficient, I'll give her that. The needle slid in with barely a pinch. She taped it down, hung the bag, and started the drip.
I watched the clear liquid descend the tube. Drop, drop, drop. It hit my bloodstream. The reaction wasn't immediate. It took about 10 minutes. First, the room tilted, just a few degrees to the left. Then the salivation started. My mouth flooded with thick, ropey spit. And then, the taste. I expected metal, platinum. I knew the taste of industrial metals. I'd inhaled enough fumes in the 70s to know the difference between copper and zinc. This wasn't metal. It was bitter, acrid. It tasted like licking a battery, followed by the heavy, suffocating blanket of sedation. It tasted like poison. "Sarah," I slurred. My tongue felt too big for my mouth. "Tastes wrong." "That's the platinum binding," she said, checking the monitor. She didn't look at me, she was looking at the heart rate. "Just relax, let it do its work." The nausea hit me like a physical blow to the gut. It wasn't the slow, creeping nausea of the flu, it was a violent rejection. My stomach contracted so hard I thought I'd snapped a rib. I lunged for the plastic basin she had helpfully placed on the bedside table. I retched until my vision went black. There was nothing in my stomach but bile and fear, yet my body tried to turn itself inside out. "Breathe, Dad," Mark said from the doorway. He wasn't helping holding the basin, he was holding his phone up, filming. "What are you doing?" I gasped, wiping a string of bile from my chin. "Documenting the process," Mark said. "For the FDA, they need to see the physiological response." I retched again, a dry, barking sound that tore at my throat. I felt weak, instantly, catastrophically weak. The drug, whatever it was stripping the energy from my mitochondria. My limbs felt like lead. "It's okay," Sarah soothed, patting my back with a rhythmic hollow thud. "This is the cytokine storm. It means the immune system is waking up. It's attacking the cancer." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this agony was the price of life. The next 3 weeks were a blur of misery. The days lost their names. It was just the drip, then the sickness, then the sleep. I stopped eating. The sight of food made me gag. Sarah said this was good. She called it metabolic fasting. She said the cancer couldn't feed if I didn't eat. So they switched me to a clear liquid diet, broth, jello, water. I lost 5 pounds the first week, 7 the next. My pants, which I rarely wore anymore because I was too weak to stand, hung off my hips. My face, once full and ruddy, began to sink. My cheekbones sharpened. My skin turned a translucent, papery gray. One afternoon, I woke up from a chemically induced nap. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the white tile. I was thirsty, desperately thirsty. I tried to reach for the water pitcher on the table. My hand trembled uncontrollably. My fingers, usually so steady, capable of titrating a solution to the microliter, shook like leaves in a gale. I knocked the glass over. It shattered. The noise brought them running. Sarah and Mark stood in the doorway. I was panting, hanging half off the bed, trying to lap up the spilled water from the nightstand like a dog, because I was too weak to lift the pitcher. "Oh, Dad," Sarah sighed, not with pity, with exhaustion. "Look at this mess." "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm just so thirsty." Mark stepped into the room. He didn't look at the broken glass. He looked at me.
He looked at my withered arms, my sunken eyes, the way my ribs were starting to show through the thin hospital gown. He smiled. It wasn't a shark smile like Sarah's. It was the smile of a man who had just won a bet. He pulled out his phone and checked the numbers.
"Stock is up to $18 a share," he murmured to Sarah. "The leaked photos of him looking like a corpse are playing well. The darkest hour before the dawn, the forums are calling it. They think the drug is fighting a war inside him." "It is," Sarah said, picking up the glass shards. She looked at me, and for a second I thought I saw a flicker of guilt, but then she blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of a researcher observing a lab rat. "We need to up the dosage," she said. "The tumor markers need to drop by the quarterly review. But he needs to look worse before he looks better. The narrative needs a climax." "Up the dosage," I rasped. "Sarah, I can't take more." "You have to, Dad," she said, plunging a syringe into my IV port. "Trust me, I'm the doctor." As the cold fluid hit my vein again, I looked at Mark. He was typing a text message. He looked up, caught my eye, and winked. "Hang in there, Arthur. You're making us a fortune." They weren't worried that I was dying. They were relieved. I closed my eyes as the room began to spin again. The metallic taste flooded my mouth. But this time, through the fog of nausea and sedatives, a single sharp thought pierced through my trust. Chemotherapy kills fast-growing cells, hair, nails, stomach lining. I had been on this treatment for a month. I ran my tongue over my teeth. My gums were sore, yes, but I reached up with a trembling hand and touched my head.
My hair. It was still there, thick, silver, anchored tight to my scalp. Real chemo makes your hair fall out in clumps within weeks, especially at the dosage they claim to be giving me. I gripped the sheet. I didn't vomit this time. I swallowed the bile. My hair was still there, but my mind was fading. They weren't curing cancer, because there was no cancer. They were manufacturing a tragedy, and I was the raw material.
The taste of platinum is distinct. I learned that in 1982 at the DuPont plant in West Virginia. We were testing a new catalyst for catalytic converters, a platinum-rhodium blend. I wasn't wearing my respirator properly, a rookie mistake, and I inhaled a cloud of the dust. For 3 days, everything I ate tasted like I was licking a handful of dirty pennies. It's a sharp, electric, metallic tang that sits at the back of the throat and vibrates. Real chemotherapy, specifically the cisplatin or carboplatin they claim to be giving me, is a platinum coordination complex. It should taste like that dust. It should taste like aluminum foil and electricity. The fluid dripping into my arm at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday did not taste like platinum. It tasted organic, alkaloid. It had the distinct bitter earthiness of a root extract, masked poorly by a synthetic sweetener. It tasted like Cephalus ipecacuana, ipecac. I lay in the dark, the green light of the heart monitor pulsing rhythmically against the white wall. Beep, beep, beep. I ran the sensory data through my mind again. Symptom 1, extreme nausea, but localized to the stomach lining, not the systemic whole-body sickness of radiation or heavy metals. Symptom 2, heavy, suffocating fog that felt like benzodiazepines. Symptom 3, no hair loss. Symptom 4, the taste, the undeniable bitter taste of an emetic designed to induce vomiting. Why would they give a cancer patient an emetic? Vomiting is a side effect to be managed, not a goal to be induced. Unless the goal was the vomiting. Unless the goal was to make me look wasted, hollowed out, and dying for the cameras.
I closed my eyes. The pieces were floating in the chemical soup of my brain, trying to form a bond. They weren't treating cancer. They were treating the image of cancer. The door handle clicked. It was a soft sound, well-oiled. The latch disengaged with a whisper. Instinct took over. I didn't tense up. I didn't gasp. I let my jaw go slack. I forced my breathing into a rhythm, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Shallow, rasping, the breathing of the dying. I heard the rubber soles of expensive sneakers squeak on the polished tile. The stride was heavy, confident. It wasn't Sarah's frantic clinical pace. It was Mark. I kept my eyes shut, but I focused my other senses. I smelled him before I heard him stop. He smelled of roast beef and expensive single malt scotch, a stark contrast to the lemon-lime electrolyte water I had been allowed to sip for dinner. He stopped at the foot of the bed. I heard the rustle of fabric, probably checking his watch or his phone. "Status," he whispered. He wasn't talking to me. He was on a call, likely with his earbud in. "Yeah, I'm looking at him now," Mark said. His voice was casual, bored. "He's out cold. The sedative cocktail we mixed is doing the trick. He sleeps 18 hours a day." I felt a hand on my wrist. His fingers were warm, greasy. He pressed down on my radial artery, checking my pulse against the monitor. Thump, thump, thump. My heart was beating strong, too strong. Despite the starvation, despite the vomiting, my heart was a stubborn old engine. It was a chemical pump that refused to quit. Mark sighed, a long, irritated exhalation through his nose. "No, that's the problem," he muttered into the phone. "His ticker is too resilient. The beta blocker dosage isn't dropping the output enough. We're sitting at 65 beats per minute resting. He looks sick, but his vitals are robust." He dropped my rest onto the bed. It hit the mattress with a thud. I didn't flinch. "Yeah, I know the timeline," Mark snapped, his voice rising slightly in agitation. "The Q3 audit is in 3 weeks. If the independent medical examiner sees a resting heart rate of 65, they're going to question the terminal diagnosis. We need him in genuine distress, Mike. We need heart failure." Heart failure. The words hung in the cold air like toxic gas. "I'm going to double the metoprolol," said Mark, "and we'll cut the electrolytes. If we can induce an arrhythmia before the investors land on Friday, we can claim the cancer has metastasized to the cardiac tissue. It's a cleaner narrative. The brave fight ended due to cardiac complications. It saves us the trouble of a long hospice period."
He laughed, a short, dry chuckle. "Don't worry, he won't feel it. He's so doped up he doesn't even know what day it is. He's just a prop at this point. A $400 million prop." He walked over to the IV pump. I heard the beep, beep, beep of buttons being pressed. "Upping the flow rate," he narrated. "We'll dry him out and slow him down. By the time you get here with the contracts, he'll be barely conscious, just enough to sign the power of attorney update." The footsteps retreated. The door clicked shut. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Only when I was certain he was gone did I open my eyes. The room looked different. 10 minutes ago, it was a hospital room where my loving family was trying to save my life. Now it was a torture chamber, a slaughterhouse where the animal is kept alive just long enough to be useful. I looked at the IV bag hanging above me, the clear fluid dripping down the line. Ipecac, sedatives, beta blockers. They were poisoning me. Not to kill me quickly, that would be murder. They were killing me by inches, manipulating my own biology to simulate a disease so they could sell a cure that didn't exist.
I wasn't a patient. I was an asset class. I was a prop. A cold, hard clarity washed over me, burning away the fog of the sedatives. It was the same feeling I used to get when a pressure valve alarm went off in the plant. The panic vanishes, replaced by pure, crystallized focus. I looked at my hand. It was withered, the skin loose, but the bones underneath were still there. "Heart failure," I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded like grinding stones. I sat up. It took effort. My abdominals cramped, protesting the movement. I reached out and clamped the IV line with the plastic roller, stopping the flow. I wasn't going to die for their Q3 audit. I looked at the monitor, 68 BPM. I wasn't sick. I was starved. I was drugged. I was being tortured. But I was a chemist, and a chemist understands that every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. They wanted to introduce variables into my system? Fine. I stared at the door where Mark had exited. "Class is in session," I whispered.
I swung my legs over the side of the bed. It was time to stop being the experiment and start running the lab.
The human tongue is a remarkable muscle, but the sublingual pocket, the space beneath it, is a traitor. It is highly vascular. If you hold a soluble drug there too long, it enters the bloodstream faster than if you swallowed it. I learned to be quick. "Open up, Dad," Sarah said, her voice tight with impatience. It was 8 a.m., time for the morning cocktail. I opened my mouth, letting my jaw hang slack, eyes unfocused. She placed the 3 pills on my tongue. 2 blue, sedatives, 1 white, the beta blocker. She held the glass of water to my lips. "Drink." I took a gulp, swishing the water around. I created a turbulence in my mouth, using the water to sweep the pills into the pocket of my cheek, pressed tight against the molars. I swallowed the water with a loud, theatrical gulp. "Good boy," she muttered, patting my cheek. She didn't check inside. Why would she? I was a vegetable. She left the room, tapping on her phone. As soon as the latch clicked, I spit the pills into my hand. They were already starting to dissolve, the bitter coating staining my palm. I wheeled myself over to the bookshelf. It was filled with books for seniors, large print crosswords, inspirational biographies, and a thick, hollowed-out dictionary I had brought from home to store emergency cash. I hadn't needed the cash, but now I needed the trash can. I popped the false spine of Webster's dictionary. Inside, a mountain of blue and white pills was growing, a toxic stash that could kill a horse. I snapped the book shut and wheeled back to the center of the room.
Over the next week, the fog in my brain lifted. The edges of the world sharpened. My hands stopped trembling. The nausea from the ipecac faded because I was spilling the IV bag into the mattress whenever they weren't looking. But as my strength returned, my performance had to degrade. If they suspected I was lucid, they would restrain me, or worse, inject me forcibly. I had to become invisible. I had to become repulsive. The next morning, when Mark came in to check the monitors, I played my ace. I sat in the wheelchair, staring at the wall, and I let myself go. I urinated, right there in the chair. The smell of ammonia filled the sterile room. I didn't move. I didn't react. Mark stopped mid-step. He wrinkled his nose, his face twisting into a mask of pure revulsion. "Jesus Christ," he gagged. "Sarah, he's pissed himself again." Sarah ran in. She didn't look concerned. She looked furious. "God damn it. The investors are coming tomorrow for the preliminary walkthrough. The room smells like a kennel." "Get the nurse," Mark said, backing out of the room. "I'm not touching him. I have a suit on." "I fired the nurse to save overhead, remember?" Sarah snapped. She grabbed a towel and threw it at my face. It hit my face. I didn't blink. "Clean him up. I have to call the PR team. We can spin this. Loss of bladder control indicates the cancer is pressing on the sacral nerves. It sells the severity." She looked at me with cold, dead eyes. "You disgusting old man." They stripped me, scrubbed me roughly with cold water, and left me shivering in bed. They left the door ajar, eager to get away from the smell. That was their mistake. By 11 p.m., the house was quiet. I waited until the lights in the hallway dimmed. I slid out of bed. My legs were weak from atrophy, but the muscles were responding. I dropped to my hands and knees. The floor was cold. I crawled inch by inch towards the HVAC return vent in the corner of the room. The house was built with a central air system. The ductwork acted like a speaking tube, carrying sound from the main living area directly up to the guest suite. I pressed my ear against the metal grate. The voices were clear. They were in the living room, directly below. "You can't keep dodging the FDA, Mark," Sarah's voice. She sounded on the verge of panic. "Agent Miller called again. He's asking for the raw data from the Phase 2 trials. The raw data, not the summary we sent." "Let him ask," Mark's voice. Arrogant, dismissive. "By the time he gets a subpoena, the deal with Meridian will be closed." "But the data doesn't exist," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking. "We made it up. We extrapolated from a sample size of 4 mice, Mark. 4. If Meridian's auditors see the raw sheets, they'll see we just copy-pasted the results." I froze.
It wasn't just that the drug didn't work. It was a complete fabrication, a Ponzi scheme built on false hope and fake science. "They won't see the raw sheets," Mark said. I heard the clink of glass on glass, ice in a tumbler. "Because we have something better than data. We have a survivor." "Arthur," Sarah said. "Exactly," Mark said. "Who cares about mice when you have a living, breathing human being who survived stage 4 pancreatic cancer? He is the proof. The Ethelgard Protocol cured him. That's the narrative. Meridian buys the company for the IP, we cash out the $400 million, and we disappear to the Caymans before the FDA unravels the paperwork." "But what about afterwards?" Sarah asked. "Once Meridian takes over, they'll want to run follow-up tests on him. They'll want to study his blood to see how the enzymes persisted. If they test him, they'll see he never had cancer markers. They'll see the chemo was fake." There was a long silence. I held my breath, my ear pressed so hard against the grate it hurt. "They can't test a corpse, Sarah," Mark said softly. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What?" Sarah whispered. "Complications," Mark said. "Natural complications. Look at him. He's 80. He's frail. He's been through a brutal treatment. It's perfectly plausible that his heart gives out a few days after the cure is verified. A massive myocardial infarction, or maybe an insulin overdose that looks like a metabolic crash."
"You want to kill him," Sarah said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a clarification. "I want to close the deal," Mark corrected. "He's the only loose end. As long as he's alive, he's evidence. If he dies of natural causes, he's a legend. The man who proved the cure worked, then passed away peacefully. No autopsy required for a cancer patient who dies at home." "When?" Sarah asked. "Friday night," Mark said. "After the money hits the escrow account. We celebrate, he sleeps, he doesn't wake up." I pulled my head back from the vent. They weren't just waiting for me to die, they had a schedule. I crawled back to the bed, my knees scraping against the tile. I hauled myself up, my arms shaking with rage. I looked at the get well soon card on the nightstand. It was signed by Sarah. "Love you, Dad." I tore it in half. Friday. I had until Friday. I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting to burn their $400 million lie to the ground. They wanted a miracle survivor. I'd give them a miracle. I'd come back from the dead and drag them to hell with me.
Hunger has a sound. It isn't the growl of the stomach. That stops after the third day. It's a high-pitched whine in the ears, a vibrating frequency that overlays everything, like a bad fluorescent bulb. It is the sound of the body eating itself. Mark and Sarah had stopped pretending I was a patient. I was no longer Arthur Reynolds, father and chemical engineer. I was Exhibit A, and Exhibit A needed to look the part. "He's still too fleshy," Mark said, standing over my bed on Tuesday morning. He poked my thigh with the toe of his shoe. "The investors want to see a survivor, Sarah. That means skeletal. That means at death's door. If he looks like he's been eating 3 squares a day, the narrative collapses." "I'll cut the caloric intake to 400, Sarah replied, making a note on her iPad. She didn't even look at me. "Broth and electrolytes only. We'll call it metabolic fasting to starve the tumor. It sounds science-y enough to fool the suits." They took away the solid food. The Jell-O disappeared. The protein shakes vanished. I was left with a cup of warm, salty water twice a day. The weight fell off me in sheets. My skin, already loose from age, began to drape over my bones like wet tissue paper. I could count my ribs by touch. I was weak, genuinely weak this time, not just playing the part. But the starvation wasn't the worst of it.
Mark installed it on a Thursday. He walked into the bathroom with a cordless drill and a wireless security camera. A blink and you miss it black orb. He mounted it high in the corner, directly facing the toilet and the shower. "What is that?" I rasped, leaning against the doorframe. "Safety protocol, Arthur," Mark said, blowing drywall dust off the lens. "You're a fall risk. If you slip in the shower or pass out on the commode, we need to know instantly. It feeds directly to my phone." He grinned. "Don't worry, I won't post the highlights to Instagram unless the stock drops."
It was the ultimate degradation. A man's dignity is the last thing he owns, and they stripped it away with a distinct, cheerful cruelty. Every time I used the toilet, the red LED blinked at me. Record, record, record. I knew Mark wasn't watching for my safety. He was watching for power. He was watching to make sure the animal in the cage knew who held the keys. I sat on the toilet, head in my hands, trembling with rage and shame. I let the shame burn. I let it sear the weakness out of my system. Let them watch, I thought. Let them see every detail. Because when I tear them down, I want them to remember exactly how much they underestimated me. Then came Friday, the day of the notary. The atmosphere in the house shifted. Sarah was frantic, pacing the hallway in her heels. Mark was wearing a tie. They were preparing the stage. "The notary will be here in 20 minutes, Mark hissed. "Is he ready?" Sarah walked into my room. She wasn't carrying the usual IV bag. She was holding a small, preloaded syringe. The liquid inside wasn't clear. It was a swirling, opalescent yellow. "Dad," she said, her voice unusually soft, "we have a visitor coming, a nice man. He just needs you to sign some papers to help with the company, to help me." "No papers," I mumbled, turning my head away. "I want sleep." "You can sleep after," she said. Her grip on my arm was iron. "But you're a little agitated today. I'm going to give you something to help you relax, just a mild sedative." I knew that color. I didn't know the exact compound, maybe a high-dose synthetic psilocybin, or perhaps a dissociative anesthetic mixed with a deliriant like atropine. Whatever it wasn't a sedative. I tried to pull my arm back. "No needle, no." "Hold him," Sarah snapped. Mark stepped out of the shadows. He pinned my shoulders to the mattress. He was heavy, smelling of sweat and anticipation. "Do it," Mark grunted. The needle slid into my deltoid muscle. Sarah depressed the plunger in 1 second flat. "There," she cooed, smoothing my hair. "That wasn't so bad. Now, in a few minutes, you're going to feel very open." They left the room to answer the doorbell. The drug hit me faster than I expected. It didn't start in the head, it started in the walls. The white paint began to breathe. The texture of the ceiling tiles started to flow like a river. "Chemistry," I told myself, gripping the sheets. "It's just chemistry. Synaptic misfirings, serotonin receptor overload. Stay anchored." But the anchor was melting. The door opened. Sarah walked in, followed by a short, balding man carrying a leather briefcase, the notary. He looked nervous. He smelled like cheap cologne and stale coffee. "This is my father," Sarah said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "As you can see, the cancer it's spread to the brain. The dementia is aggressive." I tried to speak. I tried to say, "She is lying. I am sane. Do not let me sign." But when I opened my mouth, my tongue felt like a live eel. The words that came out were not English. The blue geometry is leaking," I heard myself say. My voice sounded miles away. The notary adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Reynolds, can you hear me?" I looked at him. His face was sliding off his skull. His eyes were rotating independently. "He has good days and bad days," Sarah said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Today is hard. But we need the power of attorney to manage his medical bills. He can't do it himself. Look at him." "I see," the notary said. He pulled a document from his bag. "Mr. Reynolds, do you understand that you are signing over full legal authority to your daughter, Sarah Reynolds?" I summoned every ounce of willpower I had. I focused on the man's tie. It was red like danger. She, I stammered. Then I saw them. The shadows in the corners of the room detached themselves. They grew legs, long, spindly, jagged legs. Spiders, thousands of them. They poured out of the AC vent. They skittered across the ceiling. They dropped onto the bed. "Spiders!" I screamed, thrashing against the sheets. "Get them off! They're eating the light!" "Oh, God!" Sarah cried, grabbing my hands. "Dad, it's okay. There are no spiders." She looked at the notary. "See, he's hallucinating. The intracranial pressure is causing psychosis. Please, just let him sign so we can get him the surgery he needs." The notary looked horrified. He saw a skeletal, terrified old man screaming about insects. He didn't see a victim of poisoning, he saw a tragedy. "Of course," the notary stammered, "if he can just make a mark, that's legally sufficient given the medical circumstances." Sarah shoved a pen into my hand. It felt slimy, like a worm. "Sign it, Dad," she whispered in my ear. "Sign it and the spiders will go away." I tried to drop the pen. Mark, standing on the other side of the bed out of the notary's line of sight, dug his thumb into a pressure point in my elbow. The pain flared, bypassing the drugs. My hand jerked. "Spiders!" I whimpered. Sarah guided my hand. She moved it across the paper. X, X, X. "There," she said, pulling the paper away. "Thank you, Dad. You did good." The spiders began to dissolve into black smoke. The room spun violently to the left. "I'll notarize this immediately," the man said, backing away. "I'm so sorry for what you're going through, Dr. Sarah. You're a saint for taking care of him." "I do what I can," Sarah said. They walked out. The door clicked shut. I was alone with the melting walls. I lay there for hours as the drug metabolized. I watched the ceiling drip onto the floor. I felt insects that weren't there burrowing into my skin. I screamed until my throat was raw, but no one came. By midnight, the hallucinations faded to a dull, throbbing headache. The room solidified. The camera in the corner stopped looking like a cyclops eye and went back to being a camera. My mind cleared, leaving behind a cold, hard residue of hatred. They had my signature. They had the power of attorney. Legally, I was no longer a person. I was a ward of the state, and Sarah was the warden. They had won. I rolled onto my side, my joints popping. My stomach howled for food. I looked at the camera. I knew Mark was probably asleep, but the red light was still blinking. I didn't scream anymore. I didn't cry. I slowly lifted my hand, the one that had held the pen, and extended my middle finger. I held it there for a full minute. "Enjoy your victory, Sarah," I thought, "because you just gave me the one thing I needed. You made me desperate. And a desperate chemist is the most dangerous thing in the world." Time is a variable I have always treated with respect. In chemistry, time is the difference between a stable reaction and an explosion. A solution left to titrate for 10 seconds too long can ruin a batch worth thousands of dollars. Now, time was the only currency I had left, and I was down to my last few coins. It was Wednesday morning, 9 a.m. The sun was streaming through the high windows of the guest suite, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. To an outside observer, it was a peaceful morning in a luxury recovery ward. To me, it was the start of the final countdown. Mark entered the room first. He was vibrating with energy, fueled by caffeine and greed. He was wearing a Bluetooth headset, pacing the length of the room like a caged tiger. "Yes, I have the itinerary," he barked into the air. "Friday at 10 a.m. The signing is at noon. We want the wire transfer initiated by 1 p.m. He stopped at the foot of my bed, staring at me without really seeing me. I was slumped over, drooling slightly onto a fresh bib. I had perfected the 1,000-yard stare of the heavily sedated. "The independent medical examiner?" Mark asked, pausing. He listened for a moment, then sneered. "Dr. Eris Thorne. Never heard of him. He's Meridian's guy? Fine, let him come. We have nothing to hide." He tapped the headset to end the call and turned to Sarah, who was organizing a cart of medical supplies in the corner. "Friday," Mark said. "It's confirmed. Thorne will be here at 10 a.m. to verify the subject. He's going to do a full physical and a blood draw." Sarah dropped a box of gauze. Her hands were shaking. She picked it up quickly, glancing at me. "A blood draw?" she whispered. "Mark, we knew they'd want to see him, but I thought they'd accept our internal labs. If an outsider draws his blood..." "If an outsider draws his blood, they see a healthy 80-year-old man with no trace of the drug and no trace of cancer," Mark finished for her. "They see fraud. They see federal prison." "We can't let him draw the blood," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. "We have to. countered Mark. "If we refuse, the deal dies. Thorne has to stick the needle in. He has to see the blood fill the vial. That's the theater they paid for." He walked over to Sarah and gripped her shoulders. "But whose blood ends up in the lab is entirely up to us." I kept my breathing shallow, my eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the beta blockers kept it from racing too noticeably. "The safe file," Sarah said. "I have it ready." "Show me," commanded Mark. Sarah walked over to the kitchenette area built into the suite, a small wet bar with a marble counter and a stainless steel under-counter refrigerator. She opened the fridge. The light inside was a cool, clinical blue. She reached past the bottles of electrolyte water and pulled out a small glass medical vial with a purple cap. "This is it," she said, holding it up to the light. The liquid inside was dark crimson. "It's from the hospital archives. Patient 409. He was in remission from pancreatic cancer, treated with a legitimate enzyme therapy. I spiked it with a trace amount of our Ethelgard compound, just enough to show up on the mass spec without triggering a toxicity alarm." "Perfect," Mark said, taking the vial. He rolled it between his fingers. "So how do we get this into Thorne's bag?" "I'll do the swap during the draw," Sarah explained. She was rehearsing, talking fast to calm herself. "I'll have this in my pocket. Thorne will stick Dad. He'll fill his vial. I'll offer to label it, or I'll create a distraction. I just need 2 seconds, sleight of hand. I practiced all through med school to cheat on practicals." 2 seconds, Mark repeated. "You better not miss, Sarah. If Thorne walks out of here with Arthur's real blood, we don't just lose the money, we lose everything." He handed the vial back to her. She placed it carefully back in the fridge, behind a carton of almond milk. "And after?" Sarah asked. Her voice dropped an octave. "After the audit, if the blood passes, he's still here. He's still a witness." Mark turned to look at me. His expression was devoid of humanity. It was the look a butcher gives a side of beef, calculating the yield. "After the wire hits the account, Arthur's journey ends. We can't have him walking around, potentially getting lucid, potentially talking to a nurse down the line. We need closure." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small orange-capped insulin syringe. He didn't uncap it, he just twirled it in his fingers. "Insulin," he said. "Simple, effective, untraceable in a diabetic autopsy, and easily explained in a cancer patient as metabolic collapse. Friday night, after we pop the champagne, he goes to sleep, his blood sugar bottoms out, and he drifts off, peaceful, painless." "He's my father," Sarah whispered. "He's a $400 million liability," Mark corrected, "and on Friday night he becomes a tax write-off." He walked over to the fridge and placed the insulin syringe on the top shelf, right next to the butter dish. "Friday," Mark said again, 48 hours. Keep him weak, keep him fluid restricted. I want his veins hard to find. It'll make the distraction easier if Thorne has to dig for a vein." They left the room. Mark had a conference call with legal. Sarah had to meet the caterers for the victory party. The door clicked shut. The lock engaged. I sat there in the silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. 48 hours. The timeline was locked. Friday, 10 a.m., the independent medical examiner arrives. The blood draw. Friday, 12 p.m., the signing. Friday, 1 p.m., the payout. Friday night, the execution. I looked at the refrigerator across the room. It was maybe 15 feet away. Inside that stainless steel box were 2 items that determined my fate. The purple-capped vial, Sarah's safe blood, the key to their fortune. The orange-capped syringe, the insulin, the instrument of my death. If I did nothing, I would die on Friday night. If I screamed for help, they would sedate me and accelerate the timeline. If I tried to tell the examiner I'm healthy, Sarah would claim dementia, show the video of me screaming about spiders, and they would swap the blood anyway. I needed to break their loop. I didn't need to be strong enough to fight Mark. I didn't need to be persuasive enough to convince a stranger. I just needed to be a better chemist than my daughter. I closed my eyes and visualized the fridge. I visualized the vial. Sarah planned to swap the auditor's vial for her safe vial. Input A, real blood. Input B, safe blood. Result, success. But what if I changed the variable inside input B? If Sarah swaps the auditor's vial for a vial that contains else, something that proves fraud, she wouldn't check. She would be too nervous, too focused on the sleight of hand. She would grab the vial from the fridge, hide it in her pocket, and blindly swap it into the auditor's bag. She would be the courier of her own destruction. But to do that, I needed a sample of blood that was contaminated, a sample that belonged to someone else. I looked at the bathroom door. Mark's heart medication, the scopolamine they used on me, the alcohol Mark drank every night. A plan formed. It was jagged and dangerous like a broken beaker. I had to poison the safe blood. But I couldn't just put drain cleaner in it. That would look like tampering. It had to look like the blood of a man who was lying. I needed Mark's blood, and I needed to put it inside that purple-capped vial. The clock on the wall ticked, tick, tick. 48 hours. Tonight, I would have to crawl again. Tonight, I would have to raid the pharmacy in the bathroom and the bar in the living room. I looked at my hands. They were steady. Friday, I whispered to the empty room. I wasn't going to be the victim of a tragedy. I was going to be the author of a catastrophe. I leaned my head back and waited for the night. Wednesday night, 3 a.m., the witching hour. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic thump-thump of my own pulse in my ears. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. My body was weak. Starvation does that. But my mind was a laser. I needed reagents. I rolled out of bed. The floor was cold. I didn't stand up. I let my legs drag, sliding my feet along the tiles to minimize the sound. I looked like a ghost haunting its own deathbed. I made my way to the bathroom. This was the danger zone. The camera Mark had installed was perched in the corner, its red LED eye unblinking. It had a wide-angle lens, covering the toilet, the shower, and the sink. But every lens has a distortion at the edges, and every camera has a refresh rate. I couldn't disable it. That would trigger an alert on Mark's phone. I had to perform for it. I shuffled into the bathroom, hunching my shoulders, letting my mouth hang open. I was the senile old man needing to relieve himself in the middle of the night. I grasped the counter for support, making a show of my frailty. I knocked a bottle of lotion over. Clatter. I froze. I waited. Nothing. Mark was likely 3 scotches deep in a REM cycle. I bent down to pick up the lotion. This was the move. By crouching below the lip of the vanity, I was effectively in the camera's blind spot for a few seconds. I opened the cabinet under the sink. This was where Sarah kept the overflow supplies.
My hands, usually trembling for the audience, became steady. I rifled through the baskets. Band-Aids, extra toothpaste, cotton balls. There, a translucent orange prescription bottle. Metoprolol tartrate, 100 milligrams. Mark's beta blockers. He kept a spare supply here because he often forgot to take them before coming to check on me. I popped the cap. I shook 4 pills into my palm. I recapped it and put it back. I kept digging. I needed the kicker. I found Sarah's field kit, a black nylon pouch she used for her home visits. I unzipped it. Inside were alcohol swabs, tourniquets, and a blister pack of white tablets. Scopolamine. They used it on me to induce the hallucinations for the notary. It's a nasty drug. In high doses, it wipes memory and destroys free will. It turns you into a zombie. I took 2 tablets. I stood up, groaning theatrically, placing the lotion back on the counter. I flushed the toilet for sound cover, washed my hands for 5 seconds, and shuffled back out into the bedroom. The camera saw an old man pee and wash his hands. It didn't see the chemical weapon clenched in my fist.
Back in bed, I pulled the sheet over my head. I was no longer a patient. I was back in the lab. I didn't have a mortar and pestle, but I had ingenuity. I took the hardback book from the nightstand, a copy of the Da Vinci Code someone had left, and a heavy glass coaster I had swiped from the side table days ago. I placed the pills, 4 beta blockers, 2 scopolamine, onto the flat surface of the book's back cover. I covered them with a folded tissue to muffle the sound and contain the particulate. I took the glass coaster. Press, twist, grind. I worked the pills. I felt them snap, then crumble. I worked them until the grit turned into a fine white powder. The friction generated a tiny amount of heat.
I carefully unfolded the tissue. The powder was pure white, innocuous. If Mark ingested this, the reaction would be fascinating. The scopolamine would hit his central nervous system within 20 minutes, disorientation, compliance, amnesia. The metoprolol, 400 milligrams, is a heavy dose, would slam his blood pressure into the basement. Combine that with the ethanol, scotch I knew he would be drinking tomorrow night to celebrate the coming sale.
Alcohol potentiates beta blockers. It acts as a vasodilator. His vessels would open wide, his heart rate would slow, and gravity would do the rest. He wouldn't just fall asleep, he would crash. He would be a rag doll. And more importantly, his blood would be screaming. If a toxicologist looked at his blood after this cocktail, they wouldn't see a healthy CEO, they would see a man who was chemically unstable. They would see a drug abuser. I carefully folded the tissue into a tight, tiny packet, no larger than a postage stamp. I hid it inside the hollow of my pillowcase, right next to the seam. I lay back, listening to the silence. I didn't need a gun. I didn't need a knife. I had 400 milligrams of hypotension and a double dose of delirium. "Sleep well, Mark," I whispered into the darkness. "You have a big day of drinking ahead of you." I closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I didn't dream of dying. I dreamed of titration. I dreamed of the moment the solution turns from clear to red. The trap was set. Now I just needed him to take a drink.
Thursday night. The air in the house was heavy, pressurized by the impending wealth. I could hear the celebration from my room. It wasn't a party, just the clink of crystal against crystal, the heavy thud of shoes on hardwood, and the hum of the television. Sarah had gone to bed early, exhausted by the frantic preparations for the audit. She needed her beauty sleep to look like a trustworthy medical professional in the morning. That left Mark. Mark, the CEO. Mark, the architect of my demise. Mark, who was currently sitting in the living room, drinking the profits before the check had even cleared. I checked my pillowcase. The small, folded tissue packet was there. I palmed it. It was light, barely a gram of white powder, but in my hand it felt as heavy as a lead pipe. I sat up in bed. The starvation diet had left me lightheaded, but the adrenaline compensated for the lack of glucose. I maneuvered myself into the wheelchair. The rubber tires squeaked softly on the tile. Showtime. I rolled out of the guest suite and into the hallway. The lights were dimmed to a warm, ambient glow. I slumped my shoulders, let my head hang to the right, and engaged the core muscles of my face to droop. I became the vegetable they believed I was. I wheeled into the living room.
Mark was sitting on the Italian leather sofa, his feet propped up on the coffee table. A bottle of Macallan 25, a $2,000 bottle of scotch, sat on the bar cart next to a heavy crystal decanter. He had already transferred half the bottle into the decanter to let it breathe. He was watching CNBC, grinning at the ticker tape. I made a sound, a low, guttural groan. Mark jumped, spilling a drop of amber liquid onto his shirt. He whipped around, eyes wide. When he saw it was just me, his expression shifted from alarm to annoyance. "Jesus, Arthur," he snapped. "You look like an extra from The Walking Dead. What do you want?" I wheeled closer, my hands shaking on the rims of the wheels. I stopped about 5 feet from the bar cart. "Water," I croaked. I made the words sound wet, pathetic. "Thirsty." Mark rolled his eyes. He took a long sip of his scotch, savoring it, letting me watch him enjoy the liquid while I begged. "Thirsty," he mocked. "Of course you are. Drying out the asset." He stood up, groaning slightly as he stretched. He was already tipsy. His movements were just a fraction of a second too slow. "Fine," he said, walking past the bar cart toward the wet bar sink on the far side of the room. "I'll get you some tap water. Don't want to waste the Evian on a man who's going to piss the bed in an hour." He turned his back to me to fill a glass at the sink. The faucet ran loudly. Target acquired. The decanter was within arm's reach. The heavy crystal stopper was resting on the tray beside it. He had left it open to pour himself another round. I didn't wheel closer. That would make noise. I leaned. I leaned forward in the chair, my spine stretching to its limit. My palsied hand shot out with the speed of a striking cobra. I flicked the tissue packet open with my thumb and dumped the white powder into the open mouth of the decanter. It hit the amber liquid and vanished. I gave the decanter a tiny, imperceptible swirl with my finger on the rim to agitate the mix. The powder dissolved instantly in the alcohol. I sat back, slumping into my zombie posture, just as Mark turned off the faucet. The whole operation had taken 4 seconds. Mark walked back, holding a dripping glass of lukewarm tap water. He thrust it at me. "Here," he said, "choke on it." I took the glass with 2 shaking hands, spilling a little on my lap. I drank greedily. It was actually refreshing. "Go to bed, Arthur," Mark said, turning back to his prize. He picked up the decanter.
My heart hammered against my ribs. Drink it, you arrogant son of a bitch." Mark poured a generous 3 fingers of the spiked scotch into his glass. He swirled it, sniffing the aroma. He didn't smell the scopolamine. He didn't smell the beta blockers. He just smelled the peat and the oak. He took a massive swallow. "Smooth," he muttered to himself. He finished the glass in 2 more gulps and poured another. "Get out of here," he said, waving a hand at me without looking. "I'm celebrating." I turned the wheelchair around slowly, painfully. I wheeled back toward the hallway, but I didn't go to my room. I stopped just inside the shadows of the corridor, turning the chair so I could watch him through the crack in the doorframe. Phase 1 complete. Now we wait for the metabolism. I checked my internal clock. Mark had an empty stomach. He hadn't eaten dinner, saving room for the alcohol. The absorption rate would be rapid. The ethanol would act as a carrier solvent, dragging the alkaloids across the blood-brain barrier.
5 minutes. Mark loosened his tie. He rubbed his temples. The scopolamine was starting to interfere with his acetylcholine receptors. His vision would be getting blurry. 10 minutes. He tried to stand up to change the channel, but he stumbled. He gripped the back of the sofa, swaying. "Whoa," I heard him mutter. "That kicked." He sat back down heavily. He looked at the glass in his hand, confused. He thought it was the alcohol hitting him hard. He didn't know his blood pressure was currently plummeting as the metoprolol blocked the adrenaline receptors in his heart. 15 minutes. The slump began. His chin dropped to his chest. He jerked it up, fighting the sedation, but the fight was gone. His brain was melting into a suggestible twilight state. 20 minutes. Mark Reynolds, CEO of Ethelgard Biopharma, slid sideways onto the leather cushions. The glass slipped from his fingers and rolled onto the rug. It didn't break. Silence returned to the room. I waited another 2 minutes to be sure. I watched his chest. Rise, fall, rise, fall. It was slow, rhythmic. I wheeled myself back into the room. I didn't rush. I moved with the calculated precision of a lab technician. I approached the sofa. Mark was out cold. His mouth was slightly open, a line of drool connecting his lip to the leather. His skin was flushing, the vasodilation from the alcohol interacting with the beta blockers. I poked him hard in the shoulder. Nothing. I slapped his cheek. His head lolled, but his eyes didn't open. "Lightweight," I whispered. I worked quickly. I needed Sarah's bag. I knew she had left it on the kitchen island when she came in from the car. I wheeled to the kitchen, grabbed the black nylon pouch, and returned to the living room. I unzipped it on my lap. Inside, I found what I needed: a sterile 10cc syringe, a butterfly needle, and a rubber tourniquet. I parked my wheelchair right next to the sofa. I lifted Mark's left arm. It was heavy, dead weight. I rolled up the sleeve of his dress shirt. His forearm was soft, uncalloused, the arm of a man who signed checks, not one who built things. I wrapped the tourniquet around his bicep and pulled it tight. I tapped the inside of his elbow. The vein rose, blue, engorged, sluggish. I tore open the sterile packaging of the butterfly needle. I connected it to the syringe. I looked at Mark's face one last time. He looked peaceful. He had no idea that he was about to become the donor for the most important transaction of his life. "This is going to hurt me more than it hurts you," I said softly. "Wait. No, it isn't." I slid the needle into the vein. It went in smooth as silk. Flash.
Dark red blood flowed into the tubing. I pulled back on the plunger. The barrel of the syringe filled with thick crimson fluid. 1 cc, 5 cc's, 10 cc's. I had it. The essence of Mark Reynolds, laced with scotch, scopolamine, and heart medication. I withdrew the needle and pressed a cotton ball to the puncture site. I held it there for a minute until the bleeding stopped. I didn't want him waking up with a bruise and asking questions. I rolled his sleeve back down. I removed the tourniquet and placed his arm back across his chest, exactly how it had been. I held the syringe up to the light. It was beautiful. A deep, rich burgundy. I capped the needle. I put the supplies back in Sarah's bag, zipped it up, and returned it to the kitchen counter. I looked at the decanter. It was still half full of poisoned scotch. If he woke up and drank more, he might actually die. That wasn't the plan. I needed him alive to face the music. I wheeled the decanter to the sink and poured the rest down the drain. I rinsed it out thoroughly, then refilled it with fresh scotch from the bottle to the exact same level. I wheeled back to Mark. He was snoring softly now. I looked at the glass on the rug. I picked it up, rinsed it, and placed it on the table. The scene was reset. To the casual observer, Mark had passed out from drinking too much. He would wake up tomorrow with a splitting headache, a dry mouth, and a memory that was full of holes. He would blame the Macallan. I looked at the syringe in my hand. This was the grenade. Now I just had to pull the pin. I wheeled myself back to the guest suite, the syringe tucked safely inside my sock. I entered my room. I went straight to the mini-fridge. I opened the door. There, behind the almond milk, sat the purple-capped vial, Sarah's safe blood. I took it out. I held Sarah's vial in my left hand and Mark's blood in my right. It was time to make the swap, but not the swap they were expecting. I wasn't swapping the vial. I was swapping the content. I uncapped the purple vial. I took the syringe. And the chemistry class truly began. Friday morning arrived with the brightness of a flashbulb. The house was buzzing. Caterers were setting up a tent in the backyard for the Victory Gala scheduled for 2 p.m. A string quartet was warming up near the pool. It was a surreal juxtaposition. Outside, a party for millionaires. Inside, a crime in progress. Mark looked like death. He was slumped at the kitchen island, wearing a 3-piece charcoal suit that seemed to hang off him. He was clutching a coffee mug with both hands to stop them from shaking. "God," he groaned, rubbing his eyes. "That scotch must have been bad. My head feels like it's full of cotton, and I can't focus my eyes properly." "It's just a hangover, Mark. Pull it together," Sarah snapped. She was pacing the kitchen, her heels clicking like a ticking clock. She was wearing her compassionate doctor outfit, a soft blue cardigan over a white blouse. "Thorne will be here in 10 minutes. I sat in my wheelchair in the corner, head lolling, drool cup in place. I watched Mark. Blurry vision. That was the scopolamine affecting the ciliary muscles in his eyes. Shaking hands. That was the beta blocker withdrawal kicking in as his body tried to upregulate adrenaline to fight the suppression. He wasn't hungover. He was toxic. Sarah stopped pacing. She turned her back to Mark and reached into the fridge. She moved the carton of almond milk. She grabbed the purple-capped vial. I watched her through half-closed lids. She held it up to the light for a split second. The blood inside was dark, rich, and settled. She didn't notice that the viscosity was slightly different from the blood she had put there weeks ago. She didn't notice the microscopic puncture mark in the rubber stopper where I had injected Mark's fluid at 3 a.m. after draining the original contents into the sink. She slipped the vial into the deep patch pocket of her cardigan. "Okay," she breathed, patting the pocket. "I'm ready. Remember the plan. When he draws the blood, you ask him about the chain of custody forms. Get him to look at you. I'll do the rest." Yeah, Mark muttered. "Chain of custody. Got it." The doorbell rang. It sounded like a gavel. Dr. Eris Thorne was not a warm man. He was tall, thin, and carried a metallic hard-shell medical case. He didn't smile when Sarah greeted him. He didn't accept the offer of coffee. "Let's proceed,"
Thorne said, checking his watch. "I have a flight to Zurich at 4. They wheeled me into the living room. The light was better there. Thorne set his case on the coffee table, the same table where Mark had passed out the night before. He snapped the latches open. Inside, foam cutouts and empty vials, needles, and bar-coded labels. "Patient identification," Thorne stated, looking at me. "Arthur Reynolds," Sarah said. "Date of birth, March 12, 1945. Thorne looked at me. He lifted my eyelid with a gloved thumb. I stared blankly ahead, resisting the urge to track his movement. "Pupils are sluggish," he noted. "He's heavily medicated for pain," Sarah said quickly, "and the dementia." Thorne grunted. He wrapped a tourniquet around my left arm. He tapped the antecubital vein. "Good vascularity for a man in his condition," he murmured. He uncapped a needle. This was the pivot point. If Thorne drew my blood and secured it in his bag, the game was over. My blood was clean. It would prove I never had cancer, and it would prove the drug was a placebo. They would go to jail, but Mark would likely cut a deal, blame Sarah, and wriggle out. I didn't want a mistrial. I wanted a massacre. I needed that vial in Sarah's pocket to end up in Thorne's bag. I needed Mark's drugged alcoholic blood to be the official record. Thorne slid the needle into my vein. I didn't flinch. I watched the dark red flow shoot into the vacuum tube he was holding. It filled rapidly. 1 second. 2 seconds. Thorne pulled the vial out of the holder. It was full. He reached for a label. "So, Dr. Thorne," Mark started, his voice rasping, "about the chain of custody documents. I need to verify the—" It was weak. Mark was too out of it to sell the distraction. Thorne didn't even look up. He was already picking up the pen to write on the label. He was focused. Sarah froze. Her hand hovered over her pocket. She couldn't make the move. Thorne was watching the vial too closely. The plan was failing. I had to intervene. I needed chaos. I needed to force Thorne to look away. I closed my jaw. I positioned the fleshy side of my tongue between my back molars. "Don't think, just do." I bit down. Hard. I felt the tissue burst. The pain was blinding, electric white hot. A gush of warm, copper-tasting fluid flooded my mouth. I threw my head back and let out a strangled, gurgling sound. I started to convulse, jerking my arms and legs against the wheelchair straps. I let the blood from my tongue pool in my mouth and then cough it out, spraying a fine red mist under the white bib. "Arrgh! He's seizing!" Sarah screamed. It wasn't acting. She saw the blood on my lips and panicked. Thorne dropped the pen. "Turn him! Airway!" Thorne lunged forward to grab my shoulders, trying to keep me from choking on my own tongue. Mark stumbled backward, useless. "Hold his head!" Thorne barked at Sarah. Sarah rushed in. She grabbed my face, her hands slippery with my sweat. I thrashed harder, knocking the medical case on the table. Thorne turned his head for a fraction of a second to stabilize the chair. Now.
I saw it. In the midst of the mayhem, while I was spitting blood and shaking, Sarah's right hand dipped into her pocket. She pulled out the safe vial. She grabbed the vial Thorne had just filled, the one sitting on the table next to the fallen pen. In one fluid motion, she switched them. She shoved the real vial, my clean blood, into her pocket and placed the fake vial, Mark's poisoned blood, onto the table. "He's stabilizing," Sarah yelled, checking my pulse. I let the convulsions taper off. I slumped back, panting, letting the blood dribble down my chin. It hurt like hell, but the satisfaction numbed it. Thorne pulled back, breathless. He adjusted his glasses. "A grand mal seizure?" "It happens," Sarah said, breathless, her hand clutching her pocket tight. "The brain mets. I told you he was fragile." Thorne looked at me, then at the mess on the bib. He shook his head. "Unfortunate," he said. He turned back to the table. He picked up the vial Sarah had placed there, the vial containing the blood of Mark Reynolds, seasoned with scotch and scopolamine.
Thorne held it up. He checked the seal. He didn't notice the swap. Why would he? He had been busy trying to save a dying man's life. He slapped the label onto the vial. Patient 0, 10:15 a.m. He dropped the vial into a biohazard bag and sealed it with a tamper-evident tape. Zip. The sound was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. "I have what I need," Thorne said, packing his bag quickly. He looked at me with a mix of pity and disgust. "You should administer diazepam, Dr. Sarah. He looks unstable." "I will," Sarah said. She was beaming. She couldn't help it. She thought she had just pulled off the heist of the century. Thorne marched to the door. Mark followed him, stumbling slightly, to lock the door behind him. When the front door clicked shut, the silence rushed back into the room. Sarah let out a scream of victory. She pulled the vial of my real blood from her pocket and threw it into the fireplace. It shattered. "We did it!" she yelled, grabbing Mark and kissing him on the cheek. "Oh my God, we did it! He didn't suspect a thing!" Mark leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. I thought we blew it when he started shaking." "No," Sarah laughed. "It was perfect. It gave me the window. Dad, you crazy old bat, your dying brain actually helped us."
She walked over to me and wiped the blood from my chin with a rough towel. "Sorry about the tongue," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "But hey, you're saving the family legacy. Just hang in there a few more hours, okay?" She patted my cheek. I stared at her. My tongue throbbed. My mouth tasted of iron. "Laugh, Sarah," I thought. "Go ahead and laugh. You just sent a federal auditor back to the lab with a vial of blood that proves your CEO is high on date rape drugs and heart medication. You didn't just frame yourself, you handed them the smoking gun, the bullets, and a signed confession. The swap was complete. Now came the waiting game. I closed my eyes and swallowed the blood in my mouth. It tasted like victory." The silence in the conference room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes an explosion. We were back in the moment, the zero line. Mr. Sterling, the lead auditor from Meridian Global, held the single sheet of paper with the tips of his fingers as if it were contaminated. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. The reflection of the overhead lights obscured his eyes, making him look like a machine. Sarah was leaning forward, her hands clasped on the mahogany cable in a prayer position. She was smiling, but a small vein in her temple was throbbing. She was waiting to hear that the blood was a match for patient 409, the safe, cured blood she thought she had successfully swapped into the auditor's bag. Mark was slouching in the CEO's chair. The beta blockers I had dosed him with the night before were still suppressing his adrenaline, and the after effects of the scopolamine left him looking glassy-eyed and detached. He tapped his pen. Tap, tap, tap. "Mr. Reynolds, Dr. Sarah," began Sterling, his voice devoid of inflection. "As part of the due diligence for a $400 million acquisition, we run a standard toxicology and genomic panel on the patient zero sample. This verifies that the drug is present and that the patient is, in fact, the patient." "Standard procedure," Sarah said, nodding enthusiastically. "And I'm sure you found the enzymatic markers of the Ethelgard protocol." Sterling looked over his glasses at her. "We found a great many things in this sample, Doctor, but the Ethelgard enzyme was not one of them." Sarah's smile froze. It didn't drop. It just calcified. That must be a calibration error. The half-life is short." "We found no trace of any oncological treatment," Sterling continued, ignoring her. "The blood profile is not consistent with a stage 4 pancreatic cancer survivor. The white blood cell count is normal. The tumor markers are non-existent." Mark stopped tapping his pen. He sat up, squinting. "So he's cured. That's what we told you. What's the problem?" "The problem, Mr. Reynolds, is the toxicology report," Sterling said. He flipped the page. "The sample contains toxic levels of scopolamine." Sarah blinked. "Scopolamine?" "And ethanol," Sterling read. "Significant concentration, along with a high dosage of metoprolol tartrate." The room temperature seemed to drop. The other 3 auditors at the table stopped taking notes and looked up at Mark. "Metoprolol," Mark whispered. He touched his chest instinctively. That was his heart medication. "But the most concerning finding," Sterling said, dropping the paper onto the table, "is the DNA profile." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the polished wood. "We cross-referenced the DNA in the vial against the background checks we ran on the executive team. The blood in the vial does not belong to Arthur Reynolds." Sarah let out a breath she had been holding. She thought, they caught the swap, they know it's not Dad. She prepared her excuse. Lab mix-up at the hospital.
The DNA, Sterling said, locking eyes with the CEO, is a 99.9% match to you, Mr. Reynolds. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Sarah turned her head slowly to look at her husband. Her expression wasn't one of support, it was one of pure, unadulterated confusion. "Mark?" she whispered. Mark stood up. He tried to stand up aggressively, to assert dominance, but his blood pressure was still artificially tanked. He swayed. He had to catch himself on the table. That's impossible," Mark stammered. His voice was thick. "I didn't give blood. You drew it from him." He pointed a shaking finger at me. "We drew it from the patient," Sterling said coldly, "which suggests that someone swapped the vials, and whoever did it was either incredibly incompetent or—" he looked at Mark's swaying stance, the sweat on his brow, the dilated pupils, "or under the influence of the very narcotics we found in the sample." "I'm not on narcotics," Mark yelled. He sounded drunk. The scopolamine made his words slur slightly. "This is a setup. You're trying to tank the valuation." "Mr. Reynolds, your blood alcohol level in this sample is 0.12, Sterling said, "and you are currently exhibiting signs of scopolamine intoxication, dilated pupils, ataxia, confusion. Honestly, we should call an ambulance." "I am not confused," Mark roared, knocking his water glass over. It spilled across the contracts, the $400 million contracts that were now just wet paper. Sarah stood up, her face pale. She was running the calculations. She had swapped the vials. She had taken the safe vial from the fridge. How did Mark's blood get in the safe Nile? Why was Mark's blood drugged? She looked at Mark. She looked at the spilled water, and then slowly she looked at me. I was sitting there, the bib on the floor, the handkerchief folded on the table. I had already delivered my opening line. "You're analyzing the man who tried to poison me." But the chaos had drowned it out. They were too busy eating each other. It was time to finish it. I cleared my throat. It was a dry, sharp sound. "He's right, you know," I said. My voice was calm, authoritative, the voice of the senior engineer on the floor. The room fell silent again. Everyone turned to the invalid. "It's not impossible, Mark," I said, locking eyes with him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the empty orange prescription bottle I had swiped from the bathroom trash days ago, the one I had emptied into his decanter. I set it on the table with a soft click. "It's chemistry." Mark stared at the bottle. He stared at me. The gears in his drugged mind ground together, stripping teeth. "You," Mark whispered, "the scotch." "Scopolamine and metoprolol," I explained to the room as if I were presenting a seminar, "crushed into a fine powder, soluble in alcohol, administered approximately 12 hours ago via a decanter of Macallan 25. I turned to Sarah. She looked like she had been slapped. "And you, Sarah," I said gently, "you're a good doctor, but a terrible thief. You didn't check the vial in the fridge before you swapped it this morning. You didn't notice the puncture mark in the stopper. You were so eager to frame a dying man that you carried the evidence of your husband's poisoning right into this room. You," Sarah choked out, "you've been, awake? Lucid? Yes, for weeks." I looked at Sterling. "Gentlemen, the contracts on the table are fraudulent. The drug is a placebo consisting of saline and ipecac. The clinical trials were fabricated, and the patient zero you see before you has never had pancreatic cancer. I was misdiagnosed by my daughter and poisoned by my son-in-law to pump a stock price." I leaned back in my wheelchair, crossing my hands over my stomach. "I believe this meeting is adjourned." The silence that followed my explanation was thick and suffocating. The auditors stared, their faces a uniform mask of shock and professional outrage. The ink on the contracts, still wet from the spilled water, seemed to mock them. Mark was still standing, swaying slightly, a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. No, he's lying," he slurred, looking from me to Sarah. "He's sick. He's confused. That's not my blood. It can't be." Sarah, however, was beyond denial. Her eyes darted between me, the vial in Sterling's hand, and the rapidly disintegrating faces of the Meridian Global representatives. Panic was a wildfire consuming her. "He's delusional," she shrieked, lunging forward. Her intention was clear: grab my wheelchair, prove I was unstable, disrupt the damning evidence. But the auditors, trained in threat assessment and corporate security, reacted instantly. Two burly men flanking Sterling's side moved with surprising speed. They intercepted Sarah, their hands firmly gripping her arms. She struggled, a cornered animal, but their grip was like steel. "Get off me! He's my father! He's insane!" she screamed, thrashing against them. Meanwhile, Sterling had picked up the vial. He turned it in the light, then looked at the label. He glanced at the spilled contracts, then at Mark, who was now slumped back into his chair, mumbling. "The DNA is conclusive," Sterling stated, his voice like ice. "The toxicology is damning. Mr. Reynolds, your blood profile indicates acute intoxication with prescription sedatives and cardiac suppressants. Dr. Sarah, the blood you thought you swapped was that of your husband, drugged and compromised." He looked at me. "Mr. Reynolds, was this a planned operation on your part?" I nodded. "I am a chemist, Mr. Sterling. I observe, I analyze, and I prepare." I reached under the armrest of my wheelchair. My fingers found the small magnetic case I had taped there days ago. It contained a micro-digital audio recorder, no bigger than a USB stick. I had activated it when Mark and Sarah were discussing the insulin overdose plan in the living room. They planned to kill me tonight, after the deal closed, to cover their tracks, to ensure no one could ever retest me. I held up the recorder. I have it all: their plan, their timeline, their admission of guilt. I pressed the playback button. Mark's slurred, arrogant voice filled the room, layered with Sarah's panicked agreement. They discussed the falsified Phase 2 trials, the FDA's suspicion, the need for a miracle survivor, and the final solution. Insulin overdose that looks like a metabolic crash. As long as he's alive, he's a legend. If he dies of natural causes, he's a legend. Friday night, after the money hits the escrow account, he goes to sleep. He doesn't wake up. The playback echoed in the sterile room. Sarah stopped struggling. Her face fell, replaced by a mask of utter despair. Mark stared blankly, his mind unable to process the sound of his own voice betraying him. Sterling's face hardened. He looked at the other auditors. "Contact the authorities and terminate this acquisition immediately." One of the auditors, a severe-looking woman, was already on her phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. "Standard protocol for suspected FDA fraud and executive endangerment during a due diligence audit," she explained to Sterling, her voice barely audible. "We notified the FBI and the SEC the moment the DNA mismatch was confirmed. They're en route." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing steadily louder. Sarah started to sob. "No, you don't understand. He forced me. He threatened me." "Lying won't help you now, Dr. Sarah," Sterling said, his voice cold. "You and your husband have engaged in widespread corporate fraud, falsified trial data, and conspired to murder your own father." He looked at the wet, ruined contracts. "This deal is dead." The main doors to the lobby burst open. Uniformed officers entered, their presence commanding and absolute. They moved directly towards Mark and Sarah. "Mark Reynolds, Sarah Reynolds, you are under arrest for multiple counts of federal fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent."
Mark didn't resist. He looked utterly broken, the scopolamine and metoprolol having drained any fight from him. Sarah was still crying, being handcuffed with her arms behind her back. The auditors began gathering their things, their faces grim. They wouldn't be celebrating a buyout today. They'd be testifying in court. I watched it all unfold, the adrenaline slowly draining from my body, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. I had played the part of the broken old man for months. Now the performance was over. I turned my wheelchair around, facing the now empty doorway. The sirens had stopped.
The house was filled with the grim efficiency of law enforcement. My work here was done.
The charcoal chimney starter hissed, a column of gray smoke rising into the cool autumn air. It was a smell I hadn't realized I missed until it hit my olfactory receptors. Burning oak, ash, and fire. It smelled like 1998. It smelled like autonomy. I sat on the back porch of my craftsman bungalow. The for sale sign, which Mark had prematurely planted in the front yard 3 months ago, was currently chopped into kindling and feeding the fire in the grill. Watching the paint bubble and peel on the wooden stake was a petty satisfaction, but at 80 years old, I had earned the right to be petty. The house was quiet, real quiet. Not the sterilized, humming silence of the Ethelgard estate, where every sound was monitored by a camera or a microphone. This was the silence of dust settling, the silence of a home that belonged to me again. On the patio table next to me lay the Sunday edition of the Times. The headline was bold, taking up the top fold. Biotech unicorn collapses in fraud scandal. Below it, a photo of Sarah and Mark being let out of the courthouse in orange jumpsuits. Mark looked hollowed out, his skin gray, his eyes haunting the pavement. The detox from the alcohol and the sudden withdrawal of his lifestyle had hit him hard. He wasn't the shark anymore. He was the bait. Sarah looked different. She was looking at the camera. Her expression wasn't one of remorse. It was one of confusion. She still couldn't understand how the variables had changed. She had done the math. She had calculated the dosage. She had controlled the environment. She never accounted for the independent variable, the subject refusing to be an object.
The article was thorough. The SEC had seized Ethelgard Biopharma's assets within 6 hours of the audit. The FDA had launched a criminal probe into the fabricated Phase 2 trials. But the charges that carried the weight, the ones that would ensure they died in prison, were the state charges. Aggravated elder abuse, conspiracy to commit capital murder, FDA fraud. The district attorney was calling it the vampire case. They had tried to drain me dry, both financially and physically, to feed their ambition. I reached for the tongs. The coals were ready, white hot with a glowing red center. I picked up the steak, a 16-ounce ribeye, bone-in, marbled with white fat. I had gone to the butcher myself this morning. I walked in, no wheelchair, no cane, and asked for the best cut in the case. I slapped the meat onto the grate. Sizzle. The sound was aggressive, violent, beautiful. For months I had lived on lukewarm broth and fear. I had been told my body was failing, that my organs were shutting down, that I was a delicate thing that needed to be managed. I watched the fat render, dripping onto the coals and flaring up in bursts of orange flame.
My phone buzzed on the table. It was my lawyer. I let it go to voicemail. The house was safe. The deed was back in my safe deposit box. The millions Sarah and Mark had tried to steal were frozen in escrow, likely to be eaten up by lawsuits from the investors they defrauded. I didn't care about the money. I had my pension. I had my house. I had my mind. I flipped the steak, a perfect carbonized sear. I thought about the safe vial Sarah had carried in her pocket. The irony was chemically perfect. She had trusted the label, not the contents. She had assumed that because she put it there, it remained constant. But nature abhors a vacuum, and it abhors a static system. Things change, compounds degrade, and old men wake up. I pulled the steak off the heat. I didn't let it rest. I didn't have the patience. I plated it on a simple white dish. No garnish, no sides, just meat. I cut into it. The center was cool, deep red, rare. I took a bite. It was chewy. It required jaw strength. It required grinding. It released juices that tasted of iron, salt, and fire. It tasted like life. I chewed slowly, looking over my backyard. The grass was a little long. I'd have to mow it next week. The thought made me smile. I could mow it. I could walk behind the mower, smell the gasoline, and sweat.
Mark and Sarah would never see a backyard again. They would see concrete walls and steel bars. They would eat processed soy filler on plastic trays. They would be told when to sleep, when to wake, and when to speak. They had tried to put me in a cage. Now they were the ones in the zoo. I picked up my glass. It wasn't scotch. I'd had enough of chemical alterations for a lifetime. It was ice water, clear, cold, and clean. I raised the glass to the empty yard, to the ghosts of the spiders I had hallucinated, and to the memory of the daughter I once thought I knew. To better living through chemistry, I whispered. I took a drink, washing down the iron taste of the steak. My blood was clean. It was pumping strong, carrying oxygen to a brain that was sharp, relentless, and free. Their blood was ruined, tainted by greed, spiked by their own hubris, and cataloged in a federal evidence locker. I took another bite of the steak, savoring the resistance. Class dismissed.